In 2007, the iPhone launched, and BlackBerry's leadership wasn't worried. That single fact is the whole story in miniature, and it's worth sitting with before we go any further. Here was a company that had built the dominant business smartphone in the world, on physical keyboards, real buttons, tactile typing that executives and professionals relied on every single day to fire off emails between meetings. And when a rival showed up with a slab of glass and no keyboard at all, the internal reaction wasn't panic. It was something closer to relief. Internal assumptions at the company held that touchscreens simply weren't suited for serious business use. Typing on glass was slower, less accurate, more error-prone, and business users, the thinking went, would never tolerate that trade-off just for a nicer-looking phone. That confidence is documented in detail in the book Losing the Signal, based on interviews with former BlackBerry executives. It describes a leadership culture that saw the iPhone's lack of a physical keyboard as an obvious flaw, almost a design mistake, rather than a real competitive threat. When you read those accounts, what stands out isn't stupidity, it's the opposite. These were smart, experienced people making a reasonable-sounding argument based on real expertise. BlackBerry's engineering strength had always been security, battery efficiency, and keyboard-driven email speed. Those were genuine advantages, not imagined ones. They were exactly what had made BlackBerry the standard corporate device for years, trusted by governments, banks, and Fortune 500 companies who needed encrypted messaging and devices that lasted a full workday without a charger. So when the iPhone arrived promising a touchscreen, a limited early battery life, and no physical keyboard at all, BlackBerry's leadership looked at their own scorecard, security, battery, keyboard speed, and concluded the iPhone simply didn't compete on the metrics that mattered. And for the metrics they were used to measuring, they weren't wrong. That's the part that makes this case so useful for managers today. This wasn't a story of an obviously bad decision made by careless people. It was a story of a very good decision, by the old rules, made by people who had every reason to trust those rules, because those rules had made them the market leader. Here's the part nobody expects, and it's the actual mechanism worth understanding, not just the plot of what happened. The same strength that built BlackBerry's dominance became the company's blind spot. Leadership kept reinforcing what already worked instead of seriously testing whether customer expectations were shifting underneath them. This is a specific and repeatable failure mode, not just bad luck. It happens when a team's evaluation criteria are inherited from a previous era of competition and never get re-examined once the competitive landscape actually changes. BlackBerry's engineers and executives kept asking, is this device secure, efficient, and fast for email? Because that's the question that had always mattered. They stopped asking, or never seriously asked, what do people actually want from a phone now, and is that changing? Those are different questions, and by the time a company realizes it's been answering the wrong one, the gap is usually already wide. It's worth pausing on why this is so hard to catch from the inside. When a team is genuinely excellent at something, that excellence generates its own evidence. Sales numbers looked fine at first. Corporate contracts kept renewing at first. The people closest to the product, the ones with the most expertise and the most invested pride, are also the people most likely to interpret ambiguous early signals in a way that confirms what they already believe. This isn't a BlackBerry-specific flaw. It's closely related to what psychologists call confirmation bias, and to the broader pattern researchers describe as the success trap, where the very practices that generated past wins become rigid habits that a team defends against new evidence rather than tests against it. The stronger the past success, the harder it becomes to imagine that the thing making you strong could also be the thing making you blind. By the time BlackBerry took the touchscreen threat seriously, releasing its own touchscreen models years later, the products arrived rushed and clearly reactive, rather than confidently designed from scratch. This detail matters more than it might seem. A rushed response isn't just a slower response, it's a worse one, because good products need iteration time, and a team playing catch-up under pressure rarely gets that time. Reactive design decisions get made under a different kind of pressure than confident ones, and it shows in the final product. Users could tell the difference between a phone built because the market clearly wanted it and a phone built because a company was scared of what it might lose. Market share collapsed rapidly through the following years, from near total dominance in business smartphones down to a tiny fraction within roughly 5 years. Think about how fast that is. This wasn't a company that took decades to fade the way older industrial giants sometimes do. It happened within the span of a single product generation, essentially one sales cycle, in a global market that had, up to that exact moment, treated the company as the undisputed standard. That speed is itself part of the lesson. Markets built on smartphone-scale technology don't give slow, forgiving decline curves. They give you a narrow window to adjust, and then they move on without you. Former executives interviewed afterward described a pattern where internal warnings did occasionally surface. Engineers who saw touchscreen momentum building, who understood the underlying shift in what consumers and eventually business buyers wanted, raised concerns internally. But those warnings struggled to override leadership's confidence in the existing product line. This is maybe the most important detail in the entire case, because it tells us the failure wasn't a total absence of information. The information existed inside the company. People saw it coming. The failure was structural and cultural, a system where confidence in past success outweighed emerging evidence, and where the people closest to the shift didn't have enough authority or weren't given enough hearing to redirect the organization in time. This case gets taught constantly in business strategy courses specifically because BlackBerry wasn't incompetent. It was excellent at exactly the wrong thing to protect. That phrase deserves to be unpacked because it's the whole insight in a single sentence. Incompetence is easy to guard against. You hire well, you train people, you build review processes, and incompetence mostly gets caught. Excellence is much harder to guard against because nobody builds a review process to double-check whether their own greatest strength has quietly become a liability. Nobody schedules a meeting to ask, is the thing we're best at now working against us? That's precisely the blind spot this story illustrates, and it's why the case has outlived BlackBerry itself as a teaching tool. It's worth comparing this dynamic to a related pattern researchers and strategists have documented elsewhere, sometimes called the innovator's dilemma, where established companies with strong, profitable core products underinvest in disruptive alternatives precisely because those alternatives look worse by the metrics the established product already wins on. Early touchscreen phones genuinely were worse at fast physical typing than a BlackBerry keyboard. That was true. The mistake wasn't misreading that specific fact. The mistake was assuming that the metric that mattered yesterday would keep mattering at the same weight tomorrow without checking. The pattern recurs across industries. Established players who are excellent by the old scorecard consistently struggle to notice when customers have quietly started keeping a new scorecard. The same basic shape shows up in other widely known cases that get taught alongside BlackBerries, precisely because the underlying mechanism repeats. Photography companies that had built enormous, profitable expertise in film chemistry are commonly cited for having been slow to take digital photography seriously in-house, even in cases where their own engineers had early digital prototypes, because film was still the business that paid the bills and defined what quality meant internally. Video rental chains built around physical store networks and late-fee revenue are another commonly cited example of a business whose core operating model made a subscription, streaming-based alternative look like a worse business on the metrics that had always mattered, right up until it wasn't. None of these stories are really about any single company being unusually foolish. They're about a general pattern. When your core competitive advantage is tied to a specific technology, format, or customer habit, that advantage quietly narrows your field of view exactly where you most need to see clearly. There's also a useful distinction here between confirmation bias and something closer to what you might call scorecard rigidity. Confirmation bias is a well-documented tendency for people to notice and weight evidence that supports what they already believe, and discount evidence that contradicts it. That's clearly part of what happened at BlackBerry. Ambiguous early signals about touchscreen adoption got read through the lens of, our approach is right, rather than treated as neutral data. But scorecard rigidity is a related, slightly different problem. It's not just misreading evidence, it's continuing to evaluate a changing world using a fixed and outdated set of criteria, so that even accurate evidence gets filtered through the wrong lens before anyone even has a chance to be biased about it. A team can be reading the data honestly and still miss the shift if the data they're collecting was designed to answer last year's question. For managers reading this as more than a history lesson, the real risk isn't ignorance of a threat. It's when a team's genuine expertise and past success become the exact reason they discount a change happening right in front of them. That's a mechanism worth building a defense against, not just a fact to remember. Imagine a team where the sales department keeps closing deals on the strength of one flagship feature, while a smaller group of frontline staff quietly notices customers asking for something the product doesn't do at all. In a healthy organization, that frontline signal gets escalated and taken seriously, even when it contradicts the confident story leadership is telling itself. In an organization repeating BlackBerry's pattern, that signal gets dismissed as noise because the team's identity and expertise are built around the thing that already works. Imagine a different, more mundane version of this same pattern, one that has nothing to do with phones. Picture a regional sales team that has spent a decade winning business through in-person relationships, long lunches, golf outings, face-to-face trust built over years. That team is genuinely excellent at relationship-based selling, and for a long time the numbers prove it. Then, a younger generation of buyers starts making purchasing decisions primarily through online research, peer reviews, and self-serve product trials, largely before a salesperson ever gets a phone call. A sales team built entirely around relationship selling will tend to read early signs of that shift as these leads are just lower quality rather than the buying process itself has moved. Their expertise in one channel becomes exactly the reason they're slow to notice a second channel opening up beside it. Nothing about their skill declined. The world around their skill changed shape, and their scorecard didn't change with it. Or imagine a product team that has built its entire reputation on being the most reliable, most thoroughly tested option in its category. The vendor other companies choose specifically because it never breaks. That reliability is a real, earned advantage, and it's reasonable for the team to be proud of it and protective of the process that produces it. But if a wave of competitors starts winning customers by shipping faster and iterating in public, even at the cost of occasional rough edges, a reliability-obsessed team can easily misread that shift as customers will regret choosing sloppier options, when in fact, customer expectations about acceptable trade-offs have simply moved. The team's greatest strength, rigorous caution, becomes the lens that makes the new competitive reality hardest for them, specifically, to see clearly. Other, less accomplished teams without that history might actually notice the shift faster, precisely because they have less invested in the old scorecard. So what does a manager actually do with this, beyond noting the danger? First, separate the question, "What are we good at?" from the question, "What does the customer actually want right now?" and ask the second one on a recurring schedule, not just when a competitor's threat is already obvious. These two questions feel similar, but they are not the same question, and a team under normal day-to-day pressure will almost always default back to the first one, because it's the comfortable one, the one with a flattering answer already on file. A manager has to deliberately force the second question onto the calendar, because it will not show up there on its own. Second, deliberately give a hearing to the internal voices closest to the shift: junior engineers, frontline support staff, the people fielding actual customer complaints, because the BlackBerry case shows those voices frequently see the shift first and get overridden by confidence at the top. In practice, this means creating an actual channel, not just an open-door policy nobody uses, where someone 2 or 3 levels below leadership can flag, "Customers are asking for something we don't do," and have that flag land somewhere. It will be taken seriously rather than quietly filed away. Consider rotating a short, structured listening session onto the calendar where frontline staff present what they're hearing directly to decision-makers, without a manager in between softening or reframing the message first. Third, treat your own strongest metric with some suspicion precisely because it's strong. A scorecard that has predicted your success for years is also the scorecard you're least likely to question, and that's exactly when it deserves scrutiny. One concrete way to do this is to periodically assign someone, or a small rotating group, the explicit job of arguing against the team's current strategy using only real, available evidence essentially a structured devil's advocate exercise with a genuine mandate, not a token gesture. The goal isn't to actually abandon a good strategy on a whim. It's to make sure that if the strategy has quietly become outdated, someone in the room is actively looking for that, instead of everyone unconsciously looking for reasons to keep believing what already feels true. Fourth, watch specifically for the moment when your team starts explaining away a competitor's success rather than studying it. Their product is worse, it just looks flashier, or our customers would never accept that trade-off are the exact sentences worth pausing on because they're comfortable, plausible sounding, and sometimes true, but they are also precisely what a team says right before a BlackBerry-style collapse. The presence of that sentence in a meeting isn't proof the team is wrong. It's a signal that the underlying assumption deserves an actual test, with real customers, rather than being settled by confident tone in a conference room. Finally, when you do decide to respond to a real shift, resist the instinct to rush a reactive product out the door under pressure. A hurried response built from fear rarely beats a confident one built from conviction, and the market can usually tell the difference. It's better to acknowledge you're behind and take the time to build a genuinely considered response than to ship something rushed purely to demonstrate that you noticed the threat. Speed matters, but a rushed, fear-driven product is a worse outcome than a late, well-built one, and the BlackBerry case is a clear illustration of exactly that trade-off going wrong. None of this means constant self-doubt or abandoning what works. BlackBerry's engineering strengths were real, and a manager chasing every new trend without discipline creates its own kind of failure, whiplashing a team from strategy to strategy before any of them get a fair chance to prove out. Constant doubt is its own dysfunction, just a quieter one, and it burns a team out just as effectively as blind overconfidence does, only slower and with less obvious blame attached when it happens. The actual discipline being asked for here is narrower and more specific, and it's worth stating precisely because it's easy to round it off into vague caution. Build a habit of periodically stress testing your own core strength against the question of whether the world around it has changed, rather than assuming the thing that made you strong will keep making you strong indefinitely. That's a scheduled, structural habit, not a mood or a personality trait, and it should survive changes in leadership, market conditions, and team composition precisely because it doesn't depend on any one person remembering to be humble at the right moment. That's the concrete, practical takeaway a manager can put into place this quarter, not next year. Put, what would break our product if a competitor rebuilt it from scratch today, on the agenda, as a recurring, structured conversation, not an occasional aside, and make sure the people closest to the customer have real standing in that conversation, not just a token seat at the table. Hit follow if you've seen this happen at work.